During this short lecture, we will discuss very basic, simple sequencing exercises. So this carries from our base of support. So we move from looking at where our foundation is to poses that can move immediately into the same foundation. So the same base of support, postures that we can in one breath move directly into. So this is in your manual. You will find in your manual. You can see the page number in the description. But we'll talk about, we'll go through a few of them together, and you can fill out the rest of this as you choose, as you start to create very, very simple sequences. So we'll do one now together just to think about it so we're clear, and then you can pause the video and fill out the other three that I will give you for looking at together. So Tadasana, mountain pose. From mountain pose, let's think about three postures that come directly into mountain pose, that I don't need to change the base or my leg foundation in coming into the shape. So from Tadasana, directly one breath, maybe one other movement in the body, where else can I go? Okay, so you can think about it for yourself, but I'm going to give us three. So one breath, one movement, I have Utkatasana, directly immediately from mountain. So Utkatasana, chair pose. Directly one movement, I can move into a standing balancing pose. I'm going to say Tri Vrikshasana, second posture directly from Tadasana. And then third pose, I'm going to say a forward fold. Okay, so directly exhaling, folding forward into my Uttanasana. So those are three. You might have had something else come into your mind, and that's okay. But just very simple, one movement, one breath to move, different shapes that I can move in with the same foundation, more or less the same foundation. Okay, so the other three poses, we're looking at some different bases of support, so we can start to think about this in creating mini flows in different foundations. So for yourself, take a look at Trikonasana Triangle. Three shapes I can come in without really changing the foundation too much, okay? Or I can make one movement and come into a different shape. So Trikonasana, Janu Shirshasana, head to knee pose, Janu Shirshasana, okay? And Garudasana or eagle pose. So Garudasana, our standing balancing pose, wrapped arms and wrapped legs. Okay, so pause this video, take a couple of minutes, fill that out for yourself, just these three for the moment, and then come back and see what I thought of and see how that compares to what you were thinking of during this time. Okay, so let's see what we came up with. I have written in Sanskrit. I'm trying to force you into learning some Sanskrit. But I will say them in Sanskrit and then translate them into English and also demonstrate them so it's clear what I am speaking of. Okay, so Trikonasana or three-angled triangle pose. So three kona angle, three-angle pose. So from Trikonasana, it doesn't have to stay exactly the same foundation. But one movement, maybe one movement of a foot or widening or one shift that I could do in one breath or one breath cycle. So what I came up with was Trikonasana to Ardha Chandrasana or triangle to half moon. So if I was in my triangle shape, in my Trikonasana, in one movement I can shift into a standing balance. So one breath, I shift, and I've come into my Ardha Chandrasana, into my half moon shape, okay? Second option that I chose from Trikonasana into very easy, I could come up first and transition the back foot and then back into my Parshvakonasana, into my side angle, Uttita Parshvakonasana shape. Second option, okay? And then my third option that I chose was from my Trikonasana to come into Prasarita Padottanasana or my expanded leg stretch. So just coming up, turning the foot in. I've switched a bit from an open hip into a closed hip, and then I would fold forward into my expanded leg stretch, A, B, C, D, other variations as you choose in your practice, okay? So this is triangle pose. Those are the 3 options that I thought of. Coming into a different base of support, coming into the seated postures from Janu Shirshasana, head to knee pose. Okay. My options that I chose, the first was Marichasana A, so drawing from the Ashtanga series. I just shift the foot, I bring it down, and then I come into my bound forward fold, option 1. Sage Marichi posture. It doesn't have a meaning in the body. Second option would be from my Janu Shirshasana into Parivrita Janu Shirshasana, or a twisted Janu Shirshasana. So it's a little change in the hips. The hips become more open, both legs. And then I come into the revolved variation of head to knee pose, Parivrita Janu Shirshasana, or any other alternative that you have. There's some different options of this, okay? And then the last option I chose was from my Janu Shirshasana into my Ardha Matsyendrasana, or half Lord of the Fishes posture. So seated spinal twist, just coming into any variation of a seated spinal rotation. That was my third option. Okay. And then my last base of support, I took a standing balance, Garudasana or eagle posture. And from my eagle pose, so let's say my right leg is over, my right arm is under, coming into eagle shape, okay, if you're hooked or not hooked. My first option that I chose was a warrior 3. I could keep my hands the same depending on the flow. So I could just shift myself forward. I'm still in another standing balance, hands out to the side to prayer, whatever other arm alternative you might have. Okay. Second option that I chose was a Garudasana into a high lunge, just to kind of see how we start to shift our foundations. So if I were to uncross and step back, I've now shifted into a high lunge. I can take any other shape here. I could shift from a lunge into an open hip pose if I'm continuing through this flow, okay? So Garudasana to a high lunge or Alanasana lunge. And then last version, if I wanted to build some strength and be very mean, from my Garudasana, I bring my foot down. I can keep my arms again in Garudasana or release and come into Utkatasana, into my chair pose or my fierce position, okay? So that's what I came up with. We'll have a discussion about this, kind of about what you thought of, or maybe some other shapes that you thought about coming into. But the way that we start this is just to think about how we transition from one foundation into another. And once we've thought about it, this is where we start to create very, very simple sequences. So I'm going to pick the option of what I chose for Janu Shirshasana, okay? Just to see how we might sequence these. If I were to put all 4 of these, if I were to do a seated flow, how would I sequence them? Which posture would I choose first? Okay. It doesn't have to be Janu Shirshasana, but let's say I picked the 4 poses that I transitioned into from Janu Shirshasana. They don't have to flow together. I don't have to combine all of these into a flow, but I probably can, as you will see, just when I start to think about shifting my base of support. So for me, what makes the most sense in the body is to probably start with, of my 4 alternatives, I have Janu Shirshasana, Marichasana A, Parivrita Janu Shirshasana, and the last Ardha Matsyendrasana, my spinal twist. So probably what makes the most sense to me would be to start with Marichasana A. So I can start with a forward fold, okay? And then I just bring the foot in, Janu Shirshasana, to the front. Since my legs are staying in the shape, I just open a bit to the side, and then I take the revolved version, and then I close my hips back in, and that way I can also close a bit my joint space since I've done some opening in the hips. Then I bring it into a bit of adduction, cross movement, cross lateral movement in the body, and then I take my twist, okay? That would be what I would probably sequence it, but you wouldn't necessarily have to do it in that way. Maybe I start with Janu Shirshasana, but what you want to think about is, okay, my leg's already in this shape. I don't really want to do Janu Shirshasana into Marichasana, back into the shape and then opening. So try to do the least amount of shifting and adjusting in the body where you can put things together that make sense or create the same movement in joints that people can combine together to make more sense of those movements, okay? So that's just one example of Janu Shirshasana. And then we're going to carry this a little bit further to kind of look at more standing flows. Since we haven't talked about some of our seated postures yet in alignment, we've at least talked about in terms of standing poses, we've looked at open and closed hips. Not necessarily all of the standing balances yet, but that's okay. So what we'll start to do is kind of create warrior flows, what I call warrior flows or lunge flows. And that's bringing us into very short mini sequences where we're starting to create more vinyasa movement. So we're starting to flow one pose into the next, very specifically putting them in a very precise, specific way. Normally this is something would be more interactive and I'd be getting some feedback from you as students, but just to kind of explore what I have come up with. Again, you might have some things that pop up, but just so we get an idea of what it starts to look like to create very small, short sequences. So it's a very short sequence of 3 to 4 postures that flow from one into the next. So sometimes I call these warrior flows, but it doesn't have to be from a warrior shape, but they're most of our standing postures. Eventually, as you become familiar with sequencing, then you might throw in some inversions or arm balances or other seated poses in a standing flow. But those are things that come with a bit more experience and exploration in your own sequencing. So self-practicing sequences that you create, okay? Remembering all of this is in the framework of remembering what is closed hip and what is open hip, and being careful when you're transitioning between them. It's not to say you cannot do it. You will obviously see in some things I have created that I have transitioned between open and closed hip, but aware of your foundation and where your weight is when you're rotating between those shapes. So starting the sequence off from a high lunge position, what I've done is I've just looked at 3 other options, alternatives where I could go immediately from a high lunge. So my choices were Parsvottanasana, okay, or pyramid pose, Parivrita Parsvakonasana, revolved side angle or a revolved lunge, or a warrior 3. Okay, so I'm going to start with my Parsvottanasana sequence. So if I were to come from a high lunge, I'm kind of putting this all within the framework of what I would be teaching in a vinyasa class, which would be, I'm starting from a high lunge, but realistically I've done a half vinyasa or almost a full sun salutation A before I start this sequence. So if I were moving into this shape, let's assume that I would have done Urdhva Tadasana, folded forward, found my flat back. I've been through Chaturanga, upward dog. So I'm coming from, let's say, a downward facing dog. And then for my downward dog, maybe there's some movement I do in my legs, core strengthening might be there, but then I've stepped forward and I've started from a high lunge position. So all of this movement is starting from a high lunge. I could have included a sun salutation, but it's not mandatory. That's something that you're going to choose based on the level and the audience of the class you're teaching. So from a high lunge, my first option that I've chosen is Parsvottanasana. So I step the back foot in, or if I need, I take the hands down, I bring the back foot in, I can come back up. And then I take elbows, fist, whatever I have, and I fold forward into my pyramid pose. And then I think about 3 shapes that I could come into from my pyramid shape. So I have chosen revolved triangle, Parivrita Trikonasana, first option. Second option, warrior 3. And then last option, standing splits. Okay? This can actually also be its own flow, but just for sake of demonstration. So from my pyramid pose, I can lift up partway. I can shift directly into my revolved Trikonasana, my revolved triangle, first option. Or second option, from my pyramid shape, I can lift back up and then shift forward into a warrior 3 shape, any position of the hands, okay? Or third option, from my Parsvottanasana, I could release my hands down.
immediately shift forward into that front leg and come into standing splits. Okay. Right now mine is a standing L because I'm not very warm, but standing splits. Okay, so all of those are 3 different alternatives I can move into immediately from my pyramid pose. So this is one option. My second option, from my high lunge, instead, let's say I go from a high lunge into a revolved Parsvakonasana. So from a high lunge, same position, face this way so you can see. So from a high lunge into a revolved Parsvakonasana or a revolved lunge. Back knee down if you need. I find my twist, I expand my arms. Okay. And then I have 3 options. My first option is actually to come into the open side angle. So bringing the hands down, the back knee up if it's down, and then opening to an open hip flow. And then I can move into my open side angle pose, okay, or my extended side angle. Then maybe this carries me into an open hip flow if I'm choosing to start to open up here. Okay, my second option that I've chosen, so from my high lunge, I've taken Parivrita Parsvakonasana, and then I'm moving into revolved Ardha Chandrasana or revolved half moon. Block if you need, I lift up. I'm still in my twist. I keep the alignment of my spine and the twist in the body. Okay, second option. Third option, from my high lunge, I have my revolved Parsvakonasana. And then if you wanted to play, I'll demonstrate this the other way. Okay, if I wanted to play, so if I was teaching a more advanced class, I've come through my revolved side angle, back knee down. I can also enter into my side curl, into my Kundinasana variation where I come up, knees together, or legs splitting into my side curl variation as a more intermediate advanced option of that sequence. Okay, this is second option of high lunge flow. And then last option is what I've chosen, more a bit of a balancing flow. If I chose to come into more balancing postures, would be a high lunge directly into a warrior 3, and then continuing on from my warrior 3. So from a high lunge, switch my legs. From a high lunge, just launching myself forward and into a warrior 3, airplane arms, any movement in the arms, any hand position of the arms. Okay, this would be my third option. And then from that warrior 3, I have to remind myself what I chose. Okay, high lunge, warrior 3, and then lifting up that leg coming through. First option, eagle pose, Garudasana. Second option, high lunge into a warrior 3, into that leg coming through and up, but I grab the big toe and I take Utthita Hasta to the front. Maybe also to the side, but depending on how open my hip is, whether I want to do an open hip pose in that moment. Okay, so that's second option. Third option, high lunge, launch myself into my warrior 3. And then many of you know that I like this transition. I do this a lot in my practice. Work on my hands, come up, handstand, little hops or holding full handstand as my third option. Again, that third option in this case is going to be for obviously a more intermediate advanced audience. It's not a beginner option, okay? So each one of these, don't think about this as one long flow. That's not the intention, but it's just to start to look at your options. So to think, start to see where you can move to, what makes sense to move the body into which pose next. Some of that will come from your practice and your experience of classes and vinyasa classes, and some of that will be more intuitive and logical in terms of what the body is sort of moving you into, okay? So let's just say for this case, I would choose, if I was kind of planning and using this as a tool to plan a class, I would maybe write down my options. I'm thinking about my theme of my class. So if I were having a twist theme, let's say, or detoxing, then I would maybe go with my second option, all of my twists, yeah?
So I would move from my high lunge into Parivrita Parshvakonasana into revolved half moon. So if I had twisting as my idea or as the emphasis for my class, I would go with my second flow. But as I said, maybe I have balance as my theme, or I'm working on leg strengthening. If I had balancing in mind, then I would choose my option 3. So where I go from a high lunge into warrior 3, into maybe other balancing flows, another standing balancing flow. So you can choose any of these. There are different options to start to think about which poses you can put together and which poses flow together. This is the very most basic fundamental tool to start to create mini sequences. So don't freak yourself out. You will sometimes take classes. Sometimes in my own practice, I will end up in a flow of like 15 poses on one side. That's not always a good idea. You can create imbalance in the body if you do like, 20 lunges or hip openers on your right leg before doing any love with your left leg. Then it's going to put a little bit of imbalance in the practice. So you don't have to create these long, crazy, extravagant sequences, which you will sometimes see in classes. It can be fun. You can be creative and start to balance it out in your legs with what postures you're choosing or how you're moving in terms of facing and around your mat. But for the beginning, for yourself, very simple flows. 3 to 4 poses maximum, because also you need to remember them. So remember that if you're teaching something, the more that you're adding on, the more postures that you're bringing in, you're going to have to remember that on each side. So for your first flows, keep it very simple, keep it very basic, and postures that you're familiar with and you're comfortable in the alignment for them as well.